One of the best-selling AMD CPUs right now, actually scrap that, it's one of the best-selling CPUs period, is a CPU that I recommended you avoid at all costs when I first reviewed it. But look, that was 3.5 years ago now. Somehow today, after all of that time, it has become an extremely popular choice, outselling almost every other CPU on the market. And that CPU is the Ryzen 5 5500, a cut-down Zen 3-based processor that started life at $160 US, but today it can be purchased for just $75 US. But it's not just the $75 US price tag that's solely responsible for this thing flying off shelves. Heavily contributing to its success is extreme DDR5 pricing and a lack of AM4 processor availability, as many popular models are now sold out. For example, at our largest PC parts retailer here in Australia, PC Case Gear, the cheapest in-stock AM4 processor is the Ryzen 5 5500 at $129 Australian, making the next cheapest model, the 5600X, nearly 50% more at $189. Though this is the part I would normally recommend. And you know what I do recommend? Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their latest range of AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT, 9070 and 9070 XT graphics cards, along with their AMD B850 motherboards. The gaming series utilizes Gigabyte's WindForce cooling system, delivering exceptional thermal performance via a large triple fan cooler featuring Hawks fans, composite copper heat pipes, and a copper base plate. The 9070 XT is also available in the Elite range, offering an even larger cooler, dual BIOS support, and RGB halo effects. All models will pair nicely with one of the many B850 motherboards Gigabyte has on offer, such as the excellent value B850 Eagle Wi-Fi 6E. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. Okay, so the thing is, people buying the Ryzen 5 5500 don't necessarily care that the 5600X is faster, or that there are technically better value options out there that might cost a bit more. They really just want to build the most affordable gaming PC they can so they can do PC gaming. Makes sense, right? After all, while the 5500 isn't very impressive relative to most other processors, even those in the Zen 3 family, it is cheap, it's available, and it supports DDR4 memory, which is currently much cheaper than DDR5. So if you want to build a gaming PC for Christmas, and you want to do so while spending as little money as possible, have the masses got it right by opting for the Ryzen 5 5500. Today I'm going to find out with our standard set of benchmarks, along with some live gameplay in Fortnite, Battlefield 6 and Ark Raiders, to see just how usable the Ryzen 5 5500 is. Now, the graphs that you're about to see show the performance of the Ryzen 5 5500, as the data will almost always be CPU limited, because we're interested in CPU performance. The truth is, though, many of the results would be the same whether we used a GeForce RTX 5060 Ti or the 5090, as both GPUs are fast enough to max out the Ryzen 5 5500 at 1080p, especially when looking at our medium quality data. For novice PC builders, please don't focus on the fact that we used an RTX 5090 to measure the performance of the 5500. This is merely done to remove the GPU bottleneck. And as I said, a slower GPU would provide many of the same results in most of the games. But you know what? Let's just go look at a few graphs real quick. Take the Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty data, for example. Using the medium preset in our in-game test, the Ryzen 5 5500 limits performance to 116 FPS with the RTX 5090. And before someone cries, "This isn't real world, no one would ever use an RTX 5090 with a 5500, calm your farm. You're missing the point. Though the point aside, the truth is it doesn't really matter. The faster GPU just ensures you're always looking at CPU performance, as that really is the goal of this content. But let's say we used a slower GPU, like the RTX 5070. We would still see an average of 116 FPS in this test. In fact, we'd also see that with the 5060 Ti, and actually we'd even see it with the 4060 Ti, as it's right up there with 114 FPS. So the takeaway being, if you're happy with a little over 100 FPS in Cyberpunk 2077, with the right visual quality settings for your GPU, the Ryzen 5 5500 can facilitate that level of performance. Now, we are seeing a rapid decline in performance as we reduce GPU power with the Ray Tracing Ultra data, but how relevant this is will depend. For example, we know that most of our audience isn't going to be happy playing at well under 60 FPS. So the fact that the data here is heavily GPU limited using a 5060 Ti and 4060 Ti isn't particularly useful information when relating to how the Ryzen 5 5500 performs, as you simply wouldn't use these quality settings. So using an RTX 5090 here is actually more useful, as we can at least look at CPU performance, giving us an idea of how this might actually relate to other CPU-demanding gaming scenarios. Another example we can look at is Spider-Man 2. Using the medium settings, the Ryzen 5 5500 limits performance to 122 FPS, and this is a CPU-imposed limit, so increasing the resolution to 1440p or 4K, for example, you're not going to see the frame rate increase above this limit. If the GPU is up to the task, performance will at best remain the same. As for our testing data, had we used an RTX 5070, we would have found the same limit for the 5500, and the same also applies to the RTX 5060 Ti. In fact, it's not until we reduce GPU performance all the way down to the RTX 4060 Ti that we see a 7% decline in performance, and now the results are more GPU limited than CPU. But the 4060 Ti is a far cry from the RTX 5090, so that seems reasonable enough. Even when using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, we see that the Ryzen 5 5500 produced the same level of performance with the RTX 5090 as it did with the 5060 Ti, limiting frame rates to just shy of 60 FPS. Then we have Space Marine 2, which is a good example of a CPU-demanding game, and why testing with an RTX 5090 isn't actually a problem, because we're looking at CPU performance. As noted countless times in the past, it's about the frame rate, and in this example, the Ryzen 5 5500 can't throughput more than 71 FPS with the medium settings and 66 FPS using the ultra settings in our Horde Battle test scene. And that being the case, we see the exact same performance using the RTX 5090 as we do the lowly RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, and that's despite the fact that the 5090 should be around 4 times faster than the 4060 Ti. So I hope this data helps those who are opposed to the idea of using a flagship GPU to reduce the GPU bottleneck when CPU testing. Now, onto the actual testing. And please note, I have labeled the Ryzen 5 5500 and all of the graphs as using DDR4 memory, though I haven't done this because it's an option. It's certainly not. You can only use DDR4 memory with the 5500. I just wanted to make it clear that this is the only Ryzen 5 processor on our graph using DDR4 memory. There are also DDR5 and DDR4 versions of the Core i5-12400F. Now, the main CPU I want to compare the 5500 with in this video is the 7500F, as that is, in our opinion, the best value CPU available right now, and would be our recommendation if DDR5 pricing wasn't all messed up. Okay, with that very long disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the data. Before we jump into the gaming benchmarks, here's a real quick look at multi-core performance using Cinebench multi-core test, and we see that the 5500 isn't exactly the most snappy 6-core 12-thread processor out there, and in fact the newer 7600X is a little over 50% faster. Even the single-core performance is quite weak, though not significantly slower than the 5800X 3D, as both are Zen 3 processors. The 5500 just has significantly less L3 cache. When it comes to compression performance, the 5800X 3D is around 24% faster than the 5500, while modern 6-core processors like the 9600X are a little over 40% faster. Embarrassingly though, when it comes to decompression performance, the 5500 isn't a great deal slower than Intel's latest budget offering, the Core Ultra 5 225, which was a mere 4% faster in this example. Now here's a look at shader compilation performance, and as you might expect based on the Cinebench results, the 5500 isn't exactly a beast when it comes to compilation times, taking almost 60% longer than the 7500F in The Last of Us Part 1, a little over 40% longer in Stalker 2, and 38% longer in Marvel Rivals. Thankfully though, you can play most games while building shaders. The experience can just be a little bit janky. Okay, so frame rate performance in Rainbow Six Siege is adequate. In-game performance is going to be lower than what we're showing here in the benchmark, but when compared to the 12400F, the 5500 isn't that much slower in this example, as the Core i5 part was just 8% faster. That said, you are looking at around 60% greater performance from the 7500F. Next, we have Marvel Rivals, and this testing is highly representative of in-game performance. So that being the case, the 5500 is good for just over 100 FPS using the medium settings, and then just shy of 90 FPS with the ultra settings. So certainly very playable performance, and in this example, very similar to that of the 12400F when pairing the Core i5 processor with DDR4 memory. The fact that the 7500F is almost 50% faster isn't terribly relevant right now for those trying to build the most affordable gaming PC they can. Now, not all games are CPU demanding, even when using a processor like the 5500 that is multiple generations old, and even when new it was still considered entry level. A good example of this is Assassin's Creed Shadows, where the 5500 is roughly on par with parts like the 9600X and 14600K. So if you were using a more modest GPU, like the 5060 for example, performance would be identical even when using something like a 9800X 3D, as frame rates would be heavily GPU limited. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, here is another example where the 5500 is a good bit slower than the value king, the 7500F, but given the current economic conditions, it probably doesn't matter for most gamers. Using the medium settings, the 7500F was 40% faster, which is obviously a significant performance increase, but also the 5500 averaged 124 FPS with 84 FPS for the 1% lows, so still highly playable and certainly a very enjoyable experience. Even with the more demanding, very high settings, the 5500 was able to deliver playable performance, though the 1% lows did start to suffer a little bit here. But again, overall a highly enjoyable experience, and similar to that of the 12400F when using DDR4 memory. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty is another game where the 5500 is still able to deliver highly playable performance with the medium settings, beating the 12400F with DDR4 memory. Even the ray tracing ultra performance was good, though no budget PC is going to have the GPU firepower to use these settings anyway. A lot of budget builders will be looking at playing less demanding titles like Counter-Strike 2, and while the 5500 likely isn't ideal for a highly competitive gamer, for most it will be perfectly fine, keeping 1% lows above 100 FPS in our demanding test. As we saw earlier, the Ryzen 5 5500 is the primary limiting component for Space Marine 2. Even with the RTX 5060 Ti, you'd still be heavily CPU limited. That said, 71 FPS on average with 1% lows of 60 FPS is still very playable in this title, and even the ultra settings would be worth using. Granted, most would notice the 44% performance increase offered by the 7500F, but again, for those wishing to spend as little as possible, the 5500 could be a viable option. The Last of Us Part 2 also looks to be playable using the Ryzen 5 5500, highly playable I'd say, with over 100 FPS on average, using both the medium and very high settings. The 12400F using DDR4 was just 9% faster, while the 7500F was 47% faster. The 5500 does beat the DDR4-enabled 12400F in Spider-Man 2, and despite the 7500F delivering around 40% greater performance, the 5500 certainly is very usable in this title. Using the medium preset, we saw an average frame rate of 122 FPS, and then 57 FPS using the ultimate ray tracing settings. Mafia The Old Country also saw playable frame rates, though the 1% lows were a little bit low, but overall a solid experience given how much the 5500 costs, and it was better than the 12400F using DDR4. The 5500 won't blow your socks off in ACC, but it also won't disappoint with at least 100 FPS on average with the epic settings, and then nearly 120 FPS with the medium settings, so another example of highly playable performance. Finally, we have Baldur's Gate 3, and this game plays well in my opinion at just 60 FPS, so the Ryzen 5 5500 does well here then, with around 90 FPS on average, which is similar performance to that of the DDR4-enabled 12400F. So there you have it, the Ryzen 5 5500 is similar to the Core i5 12400F using DDR4 memory, and that means while it's kind of slow by modern standards, it's still very usable. Even though the 7500F was a little over 40% faster on average, and certainly the better option of the two in a normal market, with extreme DDR5 pricing you can see why so many budget gamers are turning to parts like the 5500. And just lastly, here's a look at a few games we didn't cover in the blue bar graphs, starting with Fortnite. And please note, I am playing on our test system with a dodgy keyboard and mouse, no audio, so just saying. Anyway, I'm using the performance mode and recording at the 4K resolution, which doesn't matter in this example because I'm using an RTX 5090 and I've done this so the footage looks decent. Of course, we are CPU limited, so regardless of your resolution or GPU used, the most performance you'll see when using the Ryzen 5 5500 in this title is around 200 FPS on average, but more crucially, the 1% lows are down around 90 FPS. So it's certainly playable. Ideally though, you would want those 1% lows much higher, but of course, this is a budget build where the goal is to spend as little as possible, so the results are actually pretty impressive. Arc rate is also played perfectly well using the Ryzen 5 5500, and this is with the visuals maxed out. I saw an average of 109 FPS with 1% lows of 73 FPS, which is probably more ideal performance for this title when compared to what we saw in Fortnite, but of course both were playable with no frame stuttering to speak of. Finally, I played a little bit of Battlefield 6, and here's a quick snippet of some of the footage while I was being chaperoned around in a tank. Using the medium settings, I saw on average 121 FPS with 1% lows of 82 FPS, so the 5500 can certainly enable a highly playable experience in this title. Okay, so let's get to it. I never really liked the Ryzen 5 5500. In my opinion, desktop APUs are yet to really make sense, and look, I've provided loads of evidence over the years as to why I feel this way, and we've also discussed it at length on the Hardware Unboxed podcast. So that being the case, I have also never been a fan of the binned models that don't feature the integrated graphics, like the 5500. AMD never priced them nearly aggressive enough at launch, and by the time they are affordable, they're no longer worth buying. And all of this was true of the 5500. But with DDR5 pricing being so out of control, does an affordable part like the 5500 finally make sense? Well, clearly a lot of people think so, as this thing has been one of the best-selling CPUs on Amazon for quite a while now. So far, we've established that in all of the games tested, it works to a satisfactory level, and in many of the examples, the performance was excellent. Still, in some of the more demanding games, the 7500F was around 40% faster, like what we saw in Space Marine 2, for example, and you absolutely will notice the difference there. The experience using the AM5 processor is just noticeably better. But of course, it does cost a lot more right now, so let's go take a look at some pricing information. For new system builders, I've put together a budget build featuring a 1TB SSD, the 9060 XT 8GB with a basic case and power supply. The key difference, of course, between these two systems is the platform. One's AM4, while the other is AM5. The 7500F processor costs twice as much as the 5500, while the DDR5 memory kit is also roughly twice that of the DDR4 kit. Still, once we add everything up, the AM5 system ends up costing $250 US more, about a 30% premium, which isn't bad given it was on average 40% faster. So based on that, you'd be significantly better off coming up with the extra $250 to get the 7500F system, as the CPU is not only much more powerful with higher bandwidth memory, but it has an actual upgrade path in the future, likely saving you money in a few years for that next upgrade. Alternatively, you could spend the same amount on the AM4 system by upgrading your graphics card to an RX 9070, which would provide significantly greater performance, providing you're not CPU limited, which in a lot of instances you will be, as we saw in this video. If you're going to invest in an RX 9070, you might as well spend $1,300 US and stick with the AM5 option, so the AM4 build really only makes sense, if at all, when spending as little as possible. Now, if you're just performing a platform upgrade, so you already have a graphics card, storage case, and power supply, the equation ends up being a bit different. In this example, the AM4 gear will set you back $330, while the AM5 option is more like $580, and that's about a 75% premium for on average 40% better performance. So that does flip the equation on its head, and the AM4 upgrade does start to make sense for those looking at spending as little as possible. And this is possibly why a lot of people are buying the 5500 right now. So that is to say, they're coming from older, outdated, maybe Intel platforms, where buying a Core i7 or i9 processor, if that's an option, costs more than the AM4 upgrade. So in my opinion, for those of you looking to build a brand new gaming PC from the ground up for Christmas, getting something like the Ryzen 5 7500F is the way to go. Saving money by going with DDR4 just doesn't really make sense, especially as a long-term play. But if you have an older PC, you've still got a decent graphics card, enough storage, then perhaps saving on the AM4 option. If that allows you to get gaming, then that might be a nice option to have. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, let us know, I guess, by doing a thing in the comment section. I could have a look at other DDR4 processors to see if they're worth it. I know 5800X3D is probably going to come up, though I don't really think you can buy those anymore. I'm not even sure you can get a 5700X3D, though that may be different in other regions. So I guess let me know if there is any more AM4 processors you want me to check out, or any other CPUs, and maybe I can do like a part 2 of this series. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Like, subscribe, do that stuff. If you want more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we have the join button or Patreon. Either will give you access to our exclusive Discord server. We do monthly live streams, we do Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.